History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. If a country possesses a powerful army, abundant resource reserves, a strategic geopolitical position and a globally admired financial system, can it go bankrupt? That question sounds silly. But it is precisely that silliness that begins all the great mistakes in history. Because we often assume that collapse is something that only happens outside, in the past, elsewhere, and not something that is creeping into every budget figure, every policy decision, and even in the suspicious silence of a society that has lost the capacity to question itself. This book is not about economics as a series of emotionless charts. It is an excavation of collective memory where every budget model, every cycle of money printing, every time the government spends more than it earns are predestined marks on the map of decline. It traces the same principles that sank Rome, shook Spain, brought down England, and now besiege America and many other modern nations. The question is not whether we will repeat the same mistakes, but whether we will realize in time that we are on the same road, just with different signs. If you have the courage to peel back the layers of rhetoric, the political promises, the strategically presented numbers, what you may see is not a strong financial foundation but a mask that has begun to show courage and possibility. You will ask a simple yet essential question. How can a great nation go bankrupt and still think it is doing fine? Before going into this summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Now let's get started. Summary of this book. Every economy runs on transactions. All transactions revolve around money. There are two types of money, real money and credit. The difference between them is not something abstract or academic. It is the core factor that determines whether an economy will boom or crash. If real money is what you have earned, saved, or the government prints out of thin air, credit is a promise. A promise that you will pay later. It is not real property but expectation, it is belief. And as expected, the credit can be much larger than the actual money. You can spend more than you earn, as long as someone is willing to lend you money. And if everyone did it at the same time, households, companies, governments, the whole economy would boom until those promises came due. Then everything turned around. This is why debt cycles exist. Humans are creatures of hyperbole. We spend based on how rich we feel, not on our actual assets. And when wealth is just an illusion inflated by credit, sooner or later the bubble will burst. The debt cycle is something very human, not a technical error but a direct result of human nature. Want more, sooner. In this section, I want to paint a concise but complete picture of the big depot debt cycle. We will go from a very brief overview to a mechanical model and then to a specific formula. Why start like that? Because most people only see the surface of the crisis, rising unemployment, falling stock prices, failing banks. But what's going on beneath the surface is decades of debt buildup, abusive fiscal and monetary policy, and a chain reaction that few people really understand. Let's start with the most concise summary. The great debt cycle can be divided into three stages. The credit boom and asset price appreciation. The peak phase when debt begins to exceed the ability to repay and the recession phase when the entire system is forced to adjust or collapse. Imagine a party where people just keep drinking because the glasses are always filled. Until the bar owner says, "It's time to pay up." The irony is that in the early years, everything goes very well. Easy credit spurs investment, incomes rise, assets earn interest. Everyone feels rich. But then a saturation point approaches when incomes are no longer enough to pay off debts, when assets are overvalued, and when investors start to worry about risk. Financial leverage then becomes a burden rather than an amplifier, and the bubble bursts. Borrowers cut spending, businesses reduce investment. Assets are sold off, banks face a liquidity crisis. And to save the situation, central banks have to intervene, lower interest rates, print money, buy back debt. All these actions, while providing temporary relief, continue to sow the seeds for the next cycle. The question is why, despite having witnessed dozens of such collapses in history, they keep repeating themselves. The reason is simple in every cycle. Most of the people who suffer the decision-makers are people who have never experienced a crisis before. People's financial memories are short, and greed is fickle. That's why cycles repeat themselves not because of randomness, but because of psychological and political mechanisms that are deeply ingrained in every economy, from the way central banks set interest rates to the way governments spend beyond their means to the chain reactions in financial markets. They are all cogs in a big machine. And when you see the whole picture, crises will never surprise you again. The great debt cycle is not calamity, it is logic. And like all logic, it can be understood, predicted, and, to a certain extent, managed. The short-term debt cycle is the most recognizable part of modern economic life. You can see it in every boom and bust. It usually lasts about 5 to 10 years. In the early stages, the central bank lowers interest rates to stimulate borrowing. Credit booms. Companies expand, consumers spend more, incomes rise. Everything seems good. But when the economy overheats, inflation begins to rise. At this point, the central bank has to step back into the role of brake. It raises interest rates to reduce spending. Businesses see higher borrowing costs and reduce investment, consumers become more cautious, the economy slows, possibly leading to a recession, and so on. Each time interest rates are cut and then raised, a short-term cycle is set in motion. It's not too serious if managed well. But there's a bigger risk when that series of short-term cycles builds up into a huge pile of debt. What I call the long-term debt cycle. Long-term debt cycles usually last 50 to 100 years. It's not easy to see. But when you stand back and look at the whole of financial history, you see strange similarities: the constant expansion of debt, the gradual impotence of policy tools, currency, and finally a full-blown crisis, not only economic but also socio-political. A country, over decades, you spend more than you earn, constantly making up for it by borrowing to make borrowing easier. You control interest rates at low levels, you print more money to buy back your own debt. Initially, the market is excited, assets increase in value, the currency is stable. You think you have found a magic formula for spending money and getting rich, but that cannot last forever. At some point, confidence in the currency you issue declines. Investors start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for the risk, debt becomes harder to repay. You print more money, causing inflation to rise sharply, people lose confidence. Capital flows flee, political crisis breaks out. And then you are forced to do what you have avoided all cycle: tighten the belt, devalue, restructure debt, or even default. That is the end of the long-term debt cycle and also the beginning of a financial order new. Many people think of the financial system as something stable, as reliable as a mechanical clock set in stone. But the truth is that it is very fragile because it is based on trust, and trust can change very quickly when people realize that promises are no longer able to be kept. That is why I do not look at individual numbers like how much debt is in GDP, but I look at the structure of the debt, the creditworthiness, the repayment power, and the social psychology behind those numbers. The cycle is not just a financial problem, but a combination of economics, politics, and psychology. I often describe the financial system as a house built on sand, where the elegant appearance hides a shaky foundation. You can temporarily strengthen it, but if you do not change the nature of the structure, the next storm will sweep it all away. One of the main tools to manage the cycle is policy, monetary. And in the next section, I will go into the mechanism of operation of those tools: interest rates, money supply, credit, and borrowing behavior. Because without understanding how these controls work, you will not be able to understand why the economic machine is broken and even less able to fix it. This is not theoretical knowledge. I have witnessed the great debt cycle operate over the decades. From the 1980s when interest rates in the U.S. reached nearly 20% to the crisis. Calm to the 2008 recession and then the COVID-19 shock. Each stage is a different version of the same cycle. Just different degrees and different social consequences. Even now as you read these lines, the cycle continues. Global debt is at record highs. Central banks are struggling between inflation and stagnant growth. Confidence in money and markets is cracking, and here we are again. At a crossroads, continue to borrow to prolong the cycle. Accept the price and restructure. To understand the great debt cycle, you need to see it as a machine that operates through repetitive steps. First is the credit expansion phase. Central banks lower interest rates to encourage borrowing. People borrow to buy houses, buy cars, businesses borrow to invest, governments borrow to spend. All of this creates a strong flow of money into the economy, consumption increases, investment increases, asset prices, especially stocks and real estate, increase sharply, confidence spreads. Everyone feels like they are getting richer. During this phase, debt increases faster than income. That is the first sign of imbalance. But no one cares because income is still rising, assets are earning, and low interest rates make the cost of debt almost invisible. A false sense of security prevails as everyone thinks they can control the risk. People even borrow more to invest in assets that are appreciating, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The more they borrow, the more prices increase, the more prices increase, the more incentive there is to borrow more. But then comes a time at this point, financial leverage is no longer effective, debt levels are so high that each additional dollar borrowed generates less growth than before. Like that fourth cup of coffee in the day, it no longer keeps you awake but starts to make your heart race, the cost of servicing the debt begins to weigh heavily. Interest rates, even though still low, cannot compensate for the risk. Banks begin to tighten credit, the real estate market stagnates, stocks fall, and silently, the cycle reverses. When the tightening phase begins, everything happens very quickly. Borrowers are forced to sell assets to pay off debts, but when many people sell, asset prices plummet. That makes the value of mortgaged assets decrease, forcing banks to demand additional collateral, selling pressure continues to increase, and the credit spiral reverses. Debts that were once easily rolled over become unsustainable, defaults spread, and the financial system begins to crack in crisis. Central banks usually do two things. First, they lower interest rates near zero levels to ease the burden of debt servicing and stimulate new borrowing. Second, they started printing money to buy bad debt, initially called quantitative easing. This seemed to help the economy weather the storm, but in reality it was just a painful delay. Because debt doesn't disappear, it just gets transferred from the private sector to the balance sheets of governments and central banks. This is when the cycle enters the post-crisis phase: low growth, high debt, near zero interest rates, no room for traditional tools. Governments start running budget deficits to offset the decline. They issue more bonds and the central bank has to print more money to buy those bonds. This is like a person drowning in debt, borrowing money from themselves to pay off old debt. In accounting terms, it may work temporarily, but in reality, it is a sign of a financial system that is being corroded from within. At some point, people lose faith in money. They don't want to hold with cash, they turn to gold, real estate, and even foreign assets. Currencies lost value, inflation flared. Governments were forced to control prices, impose withdrawal limits, or impose capital controls. What had once been considered impossible became reality. The system began to fall into a state of emergency. Some countries chose to devalue their currencies to reduce real debt. Others restructured their debt by extending the term, reducing interest rates, or writing off part of the principal. The rest fell into outright default. Each choice came with a huge price tag. Not just economic, but social. Unemployment soared, protests broke out, governments lost power, political systems were reset, but the cycle did not stop there. After the storm, a new generation emerged. Those who no longer believed in easy borrowing started to rebuild from scratch with lower debt, more cautious policies, and more stable financial models. The economy slowly recovered, confidence returned, and credit began to grow. A new cycle begins, slowly, cautiously. If you look closely at each link in the cycle, you will see warning signs. They are not always obvious. But if you know how to read the signals, you can recognize when an economy is entering a dangerous zone. For example, when private sector debt increases faster than income for many years. That is the first signal when the debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds a sustainable level. When banks loosen lending standards, when financial assets appreciate far beyond their real value. All are signs that a bubble is forming. But perhaps the most dangerous signal is when central banks start using unprecedented measures such as negative interest rates, printing money to buy private assets, or intervening in the stock market. These measures are like high doses of stimulants. Initially, they excite the market, but in the long run, they disrupt the natural structure of the system. This is why I believe that the great debt cycle is not difficult to understand. It is like the weather. It is predictable, it has patterns, it has early signs. If you live in a hurricane-prone area, you cannot prevent the storm, but you can build a hurricane-proof house. Similarly, if you understand how debt and credit work, you will not be surprised when a crisis occurs. You will know when to take risks and when to defend. You will know what is real value and what is financial illusion. Another thing I want to emphasize is that all economic policies have costs. There is no free lunch. If you lower interest rates for too long, you will create a bubble. If you print money to save the market, you will erode the value of money. If you borrow to stimulate growth, you will face the cost of repaying the debt later. The problem is that most policymakers think short-term. Their terms last only a few years, while the debt cycle lasts for decades. Therefore, they have an incentive to postpone difficulties, to push risks to the future, as long as they maintain stability first. This is why the great debt cycle is not just a story of markets but also a story of political systems. Historically, many debt crises have led to regime change, changes in monetary systems, even wars. When confidence in money and government collapses, society falls into chaos. And that is what I hope we can avoid by learning from the past and not repeating the same mistakes. In the following sections of the book, I will delve into the components of the cycle. I will analyze in detail each stage from the expansionary borrowing phase to the recession phase to the crisis phase and finally to the recovery phase. I will describe how central banks operate, how governments respond, and how people behave in each stage. I will give you a model that you can apply to any country, any cycle, past, present, or future. You do not need to be an economist to understand these things. What is needed is systems thinking, the ability to see the connection between seemingly separate phenomena. Because the economy does not operate in a straight line, it operates in cycles. And if you understand the logic of cycles, you will no longer be passive in the face of fluctuations. If I had to summarize this part in a single sentence, it would be that the great debt cycle is an inevitable consequence of how people handle money, time, and expectations. When we spend borrowed money with the belief that the future will always be bright, we are betting on an uncertainty. And when that uncertainty is broken, we realize that the biggest risk is not the market but ourselves. If the previous part helped you understand the great debt cycle as a law of nature, this part will show you how it happens specifically. Through a typical pattern, this is not a typical example. It is a series of events that repeat themselves in many countries, many periods, many different geographical conditions, but all leading to the same outcome. Government bankruptcy, not in the dramatic way of a bankrupt company but in more insidious and dangerous ways, insolvency, loss of confidence, and finally the collapse of the financial order. I built this model based on studying more than 35 debt crises over a century. There were rich countries, poor countries, democracies, dictatorships, periods of war, periods of peace. But they all went through a similar series of stages. I call it the model bankruptcy sequence. A JTIP cause sequence. The first stage is usually very bright. The country is developing or has just come out of war or is experiencing high growth. People are optimistic. The government decides to invest heavily, infrastructure, subsidies, military or social programs to raise money. They borrow domestically and abroad. They issue bonds. At first the market reacts positively because growth is high, the debt-to-GDP ratio is still at a reasonable level, but then spending increases faster than income. As incomes rise, governments begin to rely on credit to finance their budgets. They issue more bonds. They promise to raise taxes in the future to pay off their debts. But in reality, the tax system fails to keep up. Sometimes because of weakness, sometimes because of lack of political will, budget deficits become chronic. At this stage, risks begin to accumulate. Foreign investors hold a large share of the debt portfolio, meaning they can withdraw their capital at any time. The domestic currency begins to depreciate. To maintain stability, the central bank must intervene, sell foreign currency, raise interest rates, or tighten credit. These moves, while helping to maintain short-term confidence, slow growth, causing debt pressure to grow. A turning point often occurs when the economy is hit by an external shock. Commodity prices fall sharply, exports weaken, a global financial crisis occurs. At this point, investors begin to doubt their ability to repay their debts. They demand higher interest rates or refuse to buy more bonds, the currency depreciates rapidly, capital flight, foreign exchange reserves depleted, and the government faced a life-or-death choice: pay off the debt by tightening belts, cutting spending, raising taxes, tightening the currency, or printing money to buy back the debt and save the market. Most chose the latter. And when the central bank started printing money to finance the government, a process I call monumental of depths, the road to hyperinflation was open. First 5%, then 10%, then 20%. Prices rose by the week. Money lost value by the day. People started switching to foreign currencies, gold or non-traditional assets. Confidence was eroded and the financial foundations were shaky. At this stage, the indices may still look stable on paper because the government is still paying the nominal debt in full, but in reality they are paying with printed money. That is, they are devaluing the debt. That is the most sophisticated way to default. Without declaring a default, the currency loses value to the point where the lender cannot recover the real value. But the consequences are not measured. The collapse of confidence in the currency led to a banking crisis. People withdrew their money, the financial system was drained of liquidity, businesses could not borrow money, production stagnated, unemployment rose, and finally social unrest, protests, riots, and changes in government. Once confidence was broken, what happened next was no longer in the hands of policymakers. At this point, people did not wait for announcements from the central bank. They acted on survival instinct. They converted their domestic currency to foreign currency, hoarded goods, poured money into gold, land, or anything that did not lose money every week. This behavior spread like a virus, and that is what pushed hyperinflation from a potential threat to a clear reality. The authorities responded with increasingly extreme measures. Capital controls, restrictions on withdrawals, fixing prices of goods, applying artificial exchange rates, even freezing bank accounts. But all these efforts were like trying to build a dam with your bare hands in the middle of a rainy season. The more the floodwaters try to control it, the more violently the money flows, the more confidence is broken. And once confidence is lost, money is just a social contract, no longer valuable. The government then falls into a vicious cycle of paying civil servants' salaries, maintaining subsidies, and paying interest on loans. They are forced to print more money. That makes inflation rise even faster. And so they have to print more to compensate for the loss of value. The inflationary spiral is self-amplifying, each passing day is a downward slide, no longer able to control. At some point, the country is forced to admit that it cannot pay its debts on time, they request restructuring. Sometimes they negotiate with creditors to extend the maturity date, reduce interest rates or even write off part of the principal. But in many cases the loss of control happens so quickly that it leads to a situation of total default where no one gets anything back and all financial commitments are violently cancelled. Even in situations called managed default. Confidence in the country is also damaged for years, even decades. International investors withdraw from the market, the currency loses its footing. Financial contracts become worthless, interest rates skyrocket due to rising credit risks, and the domestic banking system collapses in a domino effect. A typical example is Argentina, where this entire sequence of scenarios has been repeated many times in the 220th and early 21st centuries, from the 1980s to the crisis of 2001. And then in the period 2082-23, Argentina continuously fell into a cycle of debt, devaluation, capital controls, hyperinflation, and finally debt restructuring. What is scary is not a single bankruptcy, but when bankruptcy becomes a repeating political and economic life cycle. However, each country experiences this series of collapses in its own way. Some places default silently. Through sophisticated policies and the situation was complex, and in some places it was like an earthquake with street protests, smoke and social chaos. The only thing in common is that no one is exempt. From the richest to the poorest, from large companies to small households, all were caught up in the wave of defaults. Because the root of the breakdown lies not in individuals but in a system overblown by debt and false expectations. After default occurs, countries are forced to rebuild. But it's not as simple as changing a policy or adjusting a budget. It requires rewriting the rules of the game. Often a new currency is issued, a new financial system is established, the central bank is reformed, and sometimes even the constitution is changed. This process took many years and required enormous political, social and economic sacrifices. But it is also an opportunity. Because after everything falls apart, a blank page opens. If a new generation of leaders is clear-headed and courageous enough, they can build a new system based on the principles of fiscal discipline, monetary independence and political transparency. They can learn from mistakes and avoid falling into the same old cycle. However, as history shows, that opportunity is often missed because the political forces behind bankruptcies such as populism, corruption and vote buying through public spending do not easily disappear. They are only temporarily suppressed and then resurface when painful memories are reawakened. A key point in the typical default cycle is the shift of financial costs from the private sector to the public sector and then from the public sector to society. In the early stages, individuals and businesses borrowed for consumption and investment. When things go wrong, the government comes to the rescue, taking on the debt burden to prevent a chain reaction. But when governments are exhausted, the costs are eventually passed on to the people in the form of inflation, higher taxes, asset depreciation, and loss of social security. This is an unfair but often unavoidable chain of responsibility transfer. And it is worth mentioning that throughout this process, the political and financial language class continues to maintain the illusion that the system is still in control. Reports still show slight growth. The speeches still asserted that there was no systemic risk. The indicators are still adjusted to look stable. But underneath the structure was rotting. I call this stage the reality denial stage. Where the government, the central bank and society refuse to acknowledge the scale of the crisis. No one wants to say the word bankruptcy. No one wants to think about the possibility of a complete restructuring. And so the measures chosen are often makeshift, patching, delaying and hoping for a miracle. In some cases, governments use coercion. They force domestic pension funds to buy government bonds. They force banks to hold large proportions of state assets. They impose mandatory reserve holding regulations, in theory. These are liquidity management tools. But in essence they are a form of risk transfer from the government to the financial sector. Already fragile, as the financial sector began to crack, the crisis spread to social confidence. People no longer believe that the currency will hold its value. They no longer believe that banks are safe. They withdrew money to buy gold and commodities. Basic economic relationships such as trust in contracts, trade credit, and price stability began to break down. When money is no longer a reliable measure, the market is no longer a market. This is what I consider to be a turning point. When the crisis is no longer just a financial crisis but becomes a crisis of confidence. At that point, the financial models, policies and tools that were once considered fundamental, interest rates, reserve requirements, exchange rates become meaningless because no one believes in the game anymore. It is in such a situation that the elderly are put in a dilemma. If they try to keep the currency stable, they have to squeeze the currency. This suffocates the already depressed economy. If they loosen to stimulate growth, they accelerate the depreciation of the currency. Any choice leads to losses and there is no clean exit in history. Very few countries can escape this cycle without some form of symbolic collapse. Either a massive debt restructuring, or a currency crisis, or a sweeping political change. The reason is that the contradictions built up in the system between people's expectations, government's ability to pay and market confidence cannot be resolved by technical adjustments. They need a rebuild. Reconstruction begins when a nation dares to admit that the old system is broken. That means abandoning old commitments, accepting losses, and building from scratch with sound fiscal principles and independent monetary policy. And financial transparency. This sounds simple but is rarely easy to do because the beneficiaries of the old system are often the ones with the most power. And change requires pressure from below from the very people who have suffered the most. This is why an economic crisis is often accompanied by profound political changes. Elections change, constitutions are rewritten, institutions are shaken up. Because when it is stable, society cannot maintain a state of equilibrium. To understand why countries go bankrupt, we cannot just look at the present. History is a wordless archive of decisions once considered rational. From 1865 to 1945, the world experienced a series of financial upheavals of greater magnitude and impact than any previous period. That 80-year period contained both splendor and devastation, both new order and old chaos re-emerging. The year 186 marked the end of the American Civil War, and the country entered an era of reconstruction and unprecedented industrial growth. Meanwhile, European empires such as Britain, France, and Germany began to push the race for colonies and industrialization. At the same time, the gold standard was adopted by many countries as a system to stabilize cross-national currency values, a mechanism considered civilized, standard, and reliable. Under the gold standard, currencies were pegged to a certain amount of gold and countries pledged to keep a fixed exchange rate between paper money and gold. This creates a rigid monetary framework. The government cannot print money arbitrarily because the amount of money issued is limited by gold reserves. Fiscal discipline is imperative. Economic growth must be based on real accumulation, not borrowing from the future. That creates a stable but harsh financial world. Economic crises, when they occur, are often caused by rapid capital flows or when banks lose the ability to convert paper money into gold. But because the global gold standard system was self-regulating, crises were usually contained, painful but not out of control. Then came World War I in 1914, when almost all the major powers abandoned the gold standard to finance the war. They print money, issue bonds, and mobilize all resources to feed the war machine. When the war ended, European economies were exhausted, currencies were devalued, public debt soared, and inflation became a constant threat. And when countries tried to return to the gold standard after 1918, they found that it was no longer feasible. Germany is the clearest example. To pay off war debts and reparations under the Versailles Treaty, the German government printed huge amounts of money, resulting in hyperinflation in 1923. Prices rose by the hour, the mark became worthless, and people used money for fuel or toilet paper. Economic crisis led to political crisis, contributing to the rise of Nazism. Just a few years later, in other countries such as Britain and France, attempts to return to the gold standard only added to the pressure on the banking system. Fixed exchange rates forced them to tighten monetary policy while the economy was weak, causing recession, unemployment and social discontent. The United States was a special case during the 1920s, maintaining the gold standard and at the same time becoming the world's largest creditor. That decade is often called the golden age of tent with booming stock markets, soaring consumer spending, and boundless confidence and progress. But behind the glamour was an accumulation of easy credit, asset speculation, and blindness to risk. The crash of 1929 was not an accident but the inevitable result of that blind chain. The stock market plummeted, millions of people lost money. Banks failed en masse because they could not withdraw deposits, interest rates were not low enough to stimulate recovery, and when the government failed to intervene promptly, the economy fell into a deflationary spiral. The Great Depression lasted throughout the 1930s, culminating in 1933 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a financial emergency, closed the banking system for several days, and revoked the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was the official end of the gold standard in America and the beginning of a more flexible but also more abuse-prone monetary system. 1933 was not only the end of the gold standard in the United States, but also a pivotal moment that marked a turning point in policy thinking. Previously, the government usually stayed out of economic life, playing a role of observation and minimal intervention. But the Great Recession exposed the inability of the market to regulate itself. People lost their jobs, businesses went bankrupt, the banking system collapsed, the panic was no longer a local phenomenon but a national reality. In that context, Rousseau launched the New Deal, a policy package that included large-scale public spending, unemployment benefits, infrastructure investment and banking reform, with the aim of rebuilding confidence, recreating jobs and re-establishing the government's coordinating role in the economy. This was the first time in modern history that a developed country had adopted a form of economic management that was close to the concept of cyclical management. But Roosevelt's most important act was not building bridges, roads, or establishing new institutions. It was the formal separation of the dollar from gold, the prohibition of public ownership of gold, and the re-establishment of the entire relationship between money and trust. From that point on, the value of the U.S. currency no longer depended on the gold reserves at Fort Knox but on the ability and will of the federal government to maintain economic stability and control inflation. The nature of money changed from a store of value based on precious metals. It becomes a policy tool. And if gold was once the disciplinary shackle that bound the hands of governments, now governments have full power to alter monetary policy as long as they maintain the confidence of their people and investors. From 1934 to 1936, the U.S. economy recovered slowly, but by 1937, the government decided to cut spending to reduce the deficit. That mistake sent the economy back into recession. A clear demonstration that in a crisis, withdrawing fiscal support too early can destroy a fragile recovery. This is the first lesson in the austerity trap. Something that would be repeated many times throughout the 1930s, the rest of the world grappled with similar choices. Britain withdrew from the gold standard in 1931, Germany, France, Italy. Each country is going in a different direction, but all are struggling with debt, unemployment and social unrest. And it was the economic stalemate that paved the way for the rise of extremism, which emerged in Germany and Italy. Militarism in Japan and isolationism in America. Debt and political cycles are dangerously intertwined. When people lose their jobs, their homes, their hope, they fall prey to leaders who promise to restore glory at any cost. The financial crisis refuses to stop at the market. It spills across borders, tears social contracts and shakes democracy itself. Then in 1939, World War II broke out. For 6 years, nations once again abandoned all limits, fiscal and monetary. They mobilized everything, people, machines, resources, credit to serve the war. America, which had been on the sidelines at the beginning of the decade, became the arsenal of the democratic world as production boomed, unemployment disappeared, and public debt skyrocketed. But since the whole society was mobilized for war, no one objected. After 1945, when the war ended, the world faced a new financial map. Not only did America win militarily, it was also the only country whose infrastructure was not destroyed by bombs. U.S. gold reserves account for more than half of the world's. The dollar became the strongest currency, and the Allies, economically exhausted, needed to rebuild. And thus, a new global financial order was born. That order began at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which was the genesis of the modern Great Debt Cycle. But to understand how it works, we must understand where it started. From the ravages of 2 wars, from the collapse of the gold standard, and from the urgent need to build a system that could prevent the world from repeating old mistakes. If the period from 1865 to 1945 was the era of capitalism, gold and strict limits, the period from 1945 onwards is the story of a new order, where the dollar reigns, where credit becomes the backbone of growth, and where debt cycles no longer have the crude appearance of the past but become sophisticated spirals regulated by policy. 1944, at Brighton Woods, a small resort in New Hampshire. The Allied nations gathered to redesign the global financial system after the war. They decided to use the dollar as the center because the U.S. is the only country that remains stable and holds more than 20,000 tons of gold, accounting for 2/3 of the global volume. The dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce of gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was an indirect gold standard, a semi-rigid, semi-flexible system that aimed to keep exchange rates stable and prevent inflation from spiraling out of control like in the 1920s. It worked quite well in the first 2 post-war decades. From 1945 to the late 1960s, the U.S. economy grew strongly, consumption boomed, the middle class expanded, industrial production peaked, loans, both public and private, increased but remained under control, inflation was low, and unemployment was low. The world believes a golden age is dawning, but beneath the idealistic facade, familiar dynamics are quietly brewing. To maintain its commitment to the gold standard, the U.S. government needed to keep its budget deficit low and ensure that dollars were not printed indiscriminately. But in reality, defense spending and social programs under Lyndon Johnson, especially the Vietnam War and GRIT, pushed the budget into a state of constant deficit. Other countries began to doubt whether the dollar was still backed by gold. They turned to drawing real gold from France's own American reserves. Under Charzago, the system was openly criticized as an absurd privilege because only the U.S. could print money globally without immediate consequences. In 1971, President Nixon announced the end of the convertibility of dollars into gold. It was the gold standard moment. Although it has been eroded, officially collapsed, the world entered an era of completely legal currency, with no more physical limits, only policy management and trust. From here, the modern debt cycle begins. During the 1970s, the world had to learn to adapt to a monetary system without a fulcrum, and inflation was soaring. Largely due to the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, the United States experienced a period known as stagflation. Stagnant growth combined with high inflation, a phenomenon that traditional economic theories cannot explain. To control inflation, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Walker adopted shock measures. He raised interest rates to nearly 20% in the early 1980s. This action brought inflation back under control but also threw the economy into a deep recession. Many businesses went bankrupt, unemployment rate reached 10%. However, the Kerr shock had an important consequence. It resets inflation expectations. Investors believed that Fed would always prioritize currency stability, and this created a solid foundation for the credit cycle that lasted for more than 2 decades. From the mid-1980s to the early 2000s, the United States and much of the developed world entered a period known as the Great Moderation, of steady growth and low inflation. And relatively mild recessions. It was a period when policymakers believed they had tamed the cycle, interest rates were regulated flexibly, financial markets expanded, globalization accelerated, and credit leverage rose almost unnoticed. But it was in that silence that risks began to build, as the private sector, especially households and financial institutions, began to borrow more. Real estate prices are rising steadily. Complex financial products are launched to recycle debt into investment assets. Banks became speculators, no longer just credit intermediaries. And then in 2008, the bubble burst. 2008 marked an irreversible turning point in the modern megadebt cycle. The collapse of Lehman Brothers was more than just a banking accident. It is the breaking point of a system built on leverage, greed, and the illusion that risk can disappear simply through mathematics. The entire credit structure from subprime to securitization, from swaps to hedge funds, was frozen. No one knows who is holding toxic debt, no one trusts anyone anymore. Liquidity disappears, the free market, which was considered the optimal allocation mechanism, suddenly becomes useless. Central banks are forced to step in with unprecedented roles. Buyer of last resort, lender of last resort, salvager of last resort. The U.S. Federal Reserve has launched its first quantitative easing package. Buy government bonds and risky assets to inject liquidity into the system. The central banks of Europe, Japan, and the UK all did the same. Interest rates are brought close to zero. Some places even negative. These measures were initially considered temporary but were extended for a decade. The global financial system survived, but at a price that was not immediately apparent again. Debt is used to escape the consequences of debt itself. Old balloons are replaced with new balloons. This time it's government bonds, tech stocks and real estate in megacities. The period from 2008 to 2020 can be considered a period of super cheap credit. Businesses borrow to buy back stocks, investors borrow to speculate on assets, and governments borrow to cover deficits. All of this behavior is encouraged by low interest rates and the belief that the central bank will always intervene if something bad happens. But in 2020, the COVID-19 shock woke the entire system from its long dream. The pandemic is not just a health event, it is a full-blown crisis, crippling global supply chains, freezing cash flows and pushing millions out of the labor market in just a few weeks. To prevent another Great Depression, governments rolled out huge fiscal stimulus packages ranging from direct payments to people to business bailouts. Unlike in 2008, this time central banks are not only printing money to rescue the financial system but also directly financing public spending. The line between monetary and fiscal policy has been virtually erased. The Fed buys trillions of dollars in treasury bonds, meaning the government borrows money, the central bank prints money to buy back that debt. As a result, the volume of money in the economy increased at a rate unprecedented in modern history. From 2020 to 2021, the square meter supply in the U.S. increased by more than 25%. Initially, because consumer demand was suppressed, inflation did not manifest itself. But by 2021, when the economy reopens, the spillover effects are clear. Prices of goods rose, rents rose, wages rose, and inflation began to soar. At this point, central banks are in a bind. If they continue printing money, inflation will spiral out of control. If they tighten, they will strangle an economy that is dependent on cheap credit. Phony is forced to choose the difficult path, increasing interest rates quickly and strongly from the beginning of 2022. This leads to many consequences. Stock market falls, real estate cools down. Small weak banks fail like Silicon Valley. But the bigger thing lies behind. We are at the end of a debt cycle that has lasted nearly 80 years, starting in 1945. The signs are clear: historically high public debt, declining confidence in fiat money, polarized societies, tense geopolitics, and the return of heavy-handed state intervention in the economy. The cycle I have described, credit expansion, asset boom, squeeze, default, rebuilding, is nearing its end. We don't know how it will end yet. But one thing is for sure: if we don't understand the nature of the cycle, we will always be surprised. And if we continue to repeat the belief that this time will be different, history will continue to punish us with the same old scripts. When I look into the future, I don't try to predict it by feeling. I built a system of multiple indicators, quantitative and qualitative signals, to measure the fragility of a country. Not geological or weather fragility, but financial and social fragility. What determines whether a country is heading for growth, stagnation, or quietly sliding into collapse? The indicators I use are not absolute numbers but correlations. The relationship between debt and income, between interest rates and productivity, between military power and financial position, between social expectations and capacity to meet them. Because crises don't come when a number reaches a fixed threshold. They come when the imbalances in the system exceed the tolerance of the political and social structures. When I apply this set of indicators to the United States, a country that plays a central role in the global system, the results are thought-provoking. Almost all major indicators are at alarming levels. Public debt is at a peacetime high. Interest rates are rising rapidly while productivity is stagnant, political polarization is rising sharply, confidence in institutions is clearly declining, and global standing is increasingly challenged, especially by China and a coalition of emerging countries. But what worries me more is not the individual numbers but how they add up. The combination of high debt, unbridled spending, polarized politics, and international instability creates a supercycle, a cycle of accumulation on multiple fronts simultaneously. And as I've shown throughout this book, when those vortices are in phase, soft adjustment becomes extremely difficult. My indicators show that the US and many other countries are very close to the end of the Great Debt Cycle. Not because they ran out of money, but because they ran out of political and social space to do the right thing. When the government cannot cut spending because of constituent protests, when the central bank cannot raise interest rates because the market is plunging. When any reform is crushed by extreme public opinion, we know that the problem is no longer technical but structural. That's why I not only use economic indicators to assess risk, but also closely monitor confidence indicators. I observe how people talk about government, how they invest money, how they move assets, and most importantly how they view the future. Because trust is the real currency of a system. When trust is depleted, no matter how much gold there is, the system will collapse. One of the key indicators I watch is the rate at which debt service expenses increase relative to revenue growth. As interest rates rise and the government continues to borrow to finance spending, much of the new budget will go to paying interest, a self-reinforcing spiral. The more you borrow, the more interest you pay. The more you have a deficit, the more you have to borrow. At some point the market realized that this was no longer a financial model but a regulatory PJ model. We are not there yet but we are getting close. I do not say this to instill fear but to encourage sobriety. Because it is only when we still have time and means that we can act. And action doesn't mean waiting for a political hero to appear, but understanding the nature of the problem so that we can demand real change instead of getting caught up in empty debate. I call this the three-part solution, with the key objective being to keep the cost of debt below 3% of GDP to avoid getting caught in a cycle of paying more interest on debt. The 3% number is not a magic number but a practical limit. If interest expenses exceed this level, debt will increase faster than it can be serviced. A country cannot keep borrowing to pay off its debts without giving something in return. Trust, credibility, or ability to control policy. The three parts of that solution include 1. Increasing revenue by reforming the tax system and encouraging growth. 2. Control public spending through fiscal discipline and prioritize efficient spending. 3. Restructuring debt and monetary policy to avoid relying on money printing. Start with the first part, increasing revenue sustainably. This is not simply a matter of raising tax rates. In fact, simply raising taxes without improving productivity and the investment climate will be counterproductive. The solution must start with unlocking growth momentum, encouraging businesses to invest, improving labor productivity, improving infrastructure, and investing in education. At the same time, it is necessary to reform the tax system to make it both simpler and fairer. Unreasonable tax incentives need to be eliminated. Tax evasion and cross-border transfer pricing must be dealt with seriously and more importantly. The tax system must be designed so as not to destroy incentives to work and innovate. Because a nation cannot tax its way to prosperity. The second part is controlling public spending. This is the most difficult part politically because it touches directly on interest groups. But without control over spending, no tax solution will be enough to compensate. The only way to do this without causing a backlash is to make budgets transparent, measure spending performance, and attach accountability to every dollar. Spending should be classified by strategic priority rather than by lobbying power. Investments that bring long-term benefits such as education, infrastructure, and research need to be protected. Meanwhile, wasteful, duplicate or purely political spending needs to be cut without fail. In addition, the government should adopt flexible fiscal rules, which means allowing deficits in times of crisis. But given the need to rebalance as the economy recovers, this approach avoids both extremes. Neither cutting spending when stimulus is needed, nor falling into the trap of perpetual spending when things stabilize. The third and most controversial part is monetary policy reform and public debt. Over the past decade, central banks, especially the thhey, have bought large amounts of government bonds to keep interest rates low. This helped the economy avoid a deep recession but also set a dangerous precedent. The government can spend without facing market costs. The problem is that if the central bank continues to act as the buyer of last resort, confidence in the currency will decline, and once confidence in the currency is shaken, everything else will collapse. Therefore, a clear roadmap is needed to gradually reduce dependence on quantitative easing, not abruptly but decisively. That means letting the market determine the cost of capital, that is, the interest rate within a range that the economy can bear. If this causes borrowing costs to rise, it will force the government to adjust both the former, taxes and spending, to accommodate. It is the natural discipline of the market. And if we continue to ignore it, the crisis will come from that very ignorance. The three parts of this solution cannot work independently. They are an ecosystem. Focusing only on increasing revenue without cutting spending will create pressure on people and businesses. If we only cut spending without reforming the currency, the economy will lack growth momentum. If money is printed to cover everything up, the result will be inflation, instability, and ultimately a collapse of confidence. I am not saying this is the easy path, but it is the only path if we are to escape the end that is written for every country that cannot control its debt and spending. And the good news is that path is still open. When I talk about the future, I don't intend to play the role of a prophet. I am a systems builder, and systems, fed with honest data and consistent logic, will give us warnings clear enough that we don't need hunches. And my system is warning me of one thing. The world is facing a dangerous combination of 5 elements. Each element alone is enough to shake a nation, but when added together, they create the perfect storm. The first factor is that the public debt burden is growing at an unsustainable rate. Many developed countries, led by the United States, have been spending beyond their income-generating capacity for too long. To maintain the illusion of stability, they have pushed interest rates to rock bottom, printed money to buy back their own debt, and transferred risk from the market to the central bank. This may delay the outcome but cannot erase it. The second factor is the deepening internal political divisions. Modern societies, instead of consensus on the basis of common values, are fractured into conflicting groups of ideology, class, ethnicity, beliefs, algorithms. Social media amplify extremism, media loses its cohesive role, and as a result, any necessary decision, even the right one, is easily distorted, delayed, or nullified because of emotional resistance. The third factor is the escalating geopolitical tension between superpowers. China's rise is no longer just an economic phenomenon but a structural challenge to the world order established by the West after 1945. Russia, India, and the Gulf states are also seeking to reposition their roles. Trade, monetary technology, everything is being weaponized, alliances are being torn, power blocks are being restructured. The fourth factor is environmental and biological disasters. From climate change to pandemics, it is no longer a myth but a recurring reality. Humanity's collective response to events like COVID-19 or global wildfires shows that we lack not resources but consensus and coordination. That makes every natural shock a risk of becoming a social collapse. The final and most subtle factor is the breakdown of trust in the fundamental systems of money, the rule of law, democracy, and fairness. When people feel that the rules of the game are no longer fair, that the rich are being saved and the poor are being left out, that the government is not listening but manipulating, even seemingly stable societies can disintegrate from within without a single bullet or attack. Those 5 elements not only exist in parallel, they amplify each other. High debt makes it difficult for governments to respond to the climate crisis. Political polarization turns every anti-epidemic measure into an ideological controversy. Geopolitics causes monetary solutions to fail. Shaken confidence makes every policy mistake the straw that breaks the camel's back, and vice versa every crisis. Whatever starts can turn into a full-blown crisis. I don't say these things to promote a doomsday mentality. I believe in the human capacity to learn and recover. But I also know the cycle never stops because of hope. The cycle only changes when we change our behaviors, structures, and expectations. Which history shows usually only happens after a strong enough shock. The big question is whether the world can make a soft pivot, moving from the late stage of the cycle to a new one without collapsing. The answer I think lies in 3 things. 1. The ability to honestly recognize the situation instead of denying it. 2. The political courage to make the necessary changes. And 3. Social consensuses large enough to tolerate short-term losses for long-term gains lack one of those 3 elements. Every plan is just a beautiful draft for a burning house. I often get asked, so what does the future hold? The irony is that the very question, though seemingly inquisitive, contains the seeds of tragedy because it assumes that there is a fixed, objective future. Will happen automatically if we keep moving forward. But in reality, the future doesn't happen, the future is constructed. And if we continue on our current trajectory, spending more than we earn, becoming deeply divided, losing discipline and faith, that future will not be beautiful. It was not by fate but by actions, not by destiny but by a long string of wrong decisions that all the warnings had sounded. But was ignored. So what needs to be done right now? First, we need to face the truth that public finances are unsustainable, that social trust is eroding, and that institutions are operating on a mechanism of deferring responsibility rather than solving problems. Honesty with reality is the only starting point for any meaningful reconstruction. Next, it is necessary to restore a simple but forgotten principle. No one, not even the government, can spend more than they earn forever. It's not a moral principle, it's a physical law. You can print money, you can defer debt, you can rotate budgets, but you cannot avoid the consequences of spending beyond your ability to create value. Countries that have gone through a debt default cycle all go through a familiar pattern. The golden age of leverage. The stage of change when trust is shaken. The crash stage when no one is willing to lend. And finally, painful reconstruction. But from that ashes, new beginnings have emerged with more disciplined policy systems, more cohesive societies and clearer long-term orientations. The question is not whether America or any other country can avoid a crisis, but whether we can learn from history to make the impact softer, more controlled, and less damaging. If we can move from panic response to systematic prevention, from denial to accommodation, from division to strategic consensus, there is hope. I don't believe that the current leaders will suddenly do the right thing without enough pressure. But I believe that a generation of citizens who understand cycles, who understand risks, who understand history can create that pressure. The role of people like you and me is not to replace the government but to force it to change its ways by asking the right questions, demanding transparency, rejecting hypocrisy and propaganda. I have been studying countries since I was very young, from Roman history to ancient China, from the British Empire to modern America. And one thing I learned is that no nation is forever great, and no nation is forever in ruins. Everything is a product of a chain of decisions, a chain of reactions and a chain of beliefs. You can't control everything, but you can decide how you react when things start to shake. We live in a time where things can change very quickly. Technology can create unprecedented disruption, but it can also amplify inequality. Politics can produce great leaders, but it can also bring extremists to power. Money can serve recovery, but it can also fuel hyperinflation. Which outcome happens will largely depend on where we recognize ourselves in the cycle. And have the courage to change course before it's too late. Thank you for joining me all the way to the end of How Country Got the Big School. This is not simply a book about economics or public finance, but a journey. A journey through time, through cycles, through the hidden repetitions of history and above all a journey to discover the truth that many deliberately avoid. That seemingly invincible nations can slide into ruin if they lose the ability to look in the mirror. If you have listened this far, I believe you are not only looking to understand money but also to understand how the world works. Not the kind of understanding that helps you answer a test question correctly, but the kind that makes you look at the daily news with different eyes. Less panic but more alert, less into sweet promises and starting to wonder who is writing the financial script for my country. I hope that this book, though sometimes dry and thorny, has helped you form a sustainable cognitive framework. Not to make you pessimistic but not naive, not to make you angry without reason but so that you know when to ask for a change. Sometimes an informed citizen is worth more than an incompetent policymaker. If you found this book helpful, please take a few seconds to rate it. Not for me but for those who come after you. A sincere comment is sometimes more powerful than a media campaign. If you find it lacking, don't hesitate to say so. Because we only learn when we are challenged honestly. And if you have any other titles in mind that are more challenging, more profound, or simply keep you thinking about them, please send them to me. I will try to read it with you slowly but not mercifully. Because the world does not lack good books, it only lacks people willing to listen to them with the ears of one who does not want to be lulled to sleep. See you in the next book.